The betrothal contract had been signed in September, using ink the color of dried blood, and Isadora Dunmore had not slept a full night since. She stood now at the tall window of Dunmore Hall's East Gallery, her breath clouding against the cold glass, watching the moors stretch out beneath a pewter sky. Autumn had stripped the birch trees bare. They stood like pale sentinels along the estate's boundary wall, skeletal, leafless, beautiful in their desolation, and Isadora understood them completely. She was 22 years old. She had excellent posture, a command of 3 languages, and an embroidery technique that her mother described as nearly perfect. She played the pianoforte without error. She never raised her voice in company. She knew precisely how many inches separated a lady from disgrace. And she had spent her entire life measuring that distance with a jeweler's precision. None of it had saved her. Lord Aldrich Pemberton, Earl of Cavendish, would arrive at Dunmore Hall by the week's end. The wedding date had been set for the 23rd of November. Her father, Sir Ewan Dunmore, had announced this at dinner with the same tone he used to discuss livestock acquisition, and her mother had wept with joy so performative it had made Isadora's chest hollow. "You will be a countess," her mother had breathed, pressing both hands to her heart. "I will be a prisoner with a better title," Isadora had thought, and said nothing. She pressed her fingertip to the glass. Outside, below, the estate's stone-flagged courtyard was alive with the particular industry of a household, preparing for a great man's arrival. Cartloads of firewood were being unloaded. The grooms were whitewashing the stable doors. And there, moving through the controlled chaos with an ease that made her chest ache with a specific, terrible familiarity, Callum Mackay. He was directing the placement of a cartload of timber with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being listened to, despite the fact that he held no title, no hereditary lands, no seat in any parliament. He was her father's chief steward, had been for 4 years. And watching him move through the world was the one thing Isadora had never managed to make herself stop doing. He was tall, dark-haired, the kind of face that made women forget the social architecture they'd been trained to maintain. But it was not merely his appearance that had undone her. It was the way he read 3 books in a week and argued politics with her father's guests as though he had every right to an opinion. The way he'd once spent 2 full hours helping the estate's blacksmith's youngest son learn his letters, crouched in the stable yard with a piece of chalk and infinite patience. The way he looked at her, sometimes, across a crowded room, not with hunger, not with impertinence, but with an expression that suggested he saw something in her that she had not yet seen in herself. They should never have spoken. The distance between a baronet's daughter and a steward was not measured in feet. It was measured in centuries of rigid social architecture. And yet, the first real conversation had happened 18 months ago in the library, during a thunderstorm that had trapped them both. He'd been cataloging the estate's ledgers. She'd been hiding from her mother's increasingly frantic preparations for the season. The storm had come in fast off the moors, filling the library with the scent of rain and old leather, and he had looked up from his ledger and said, perfectly calmly, "You've been staring at the Voltaire for 20 minutes without turning a page. Either it has become exceptionally difficult, or you have something quite different on your mind." She had been appalled, and then she had laughed. And then, for the first time in memory, she had told someone the truth. That had been the beginning. The library, then the walled garden, then the ruined folly at the estate's far edge, where they had spent September afternoons that she now held like contraband, precious, hidden, dangerous. He had argued philosophy with her and challenged her opinions without apology, and listened to her as though what she thought genuinely altered the shape of the world. She had fallen in love with him with the slow, unstoppable certainty of a tide coming in. And now, below, he was watching a cart being unloaded, and in 4 days Lord Aldrich Pemberton would arrive to claim her, and there was nothing either of them could do. Or so she had believed. Until last night. The letter had been tucked beneath her poetry volume at precisely 11 o'clock. She knew it had not been there at 10 because she had retrieved the book herself. 4 lines in Callum's precise, educated hand. The folly. After the household retires, there is something you must know before Pemberton arrives. I would not ask this of you if I had any other choice. Come or do not. But know that what I carry concerns your life, not merely your heart. She had read it 7 times, then she had burned it, and she had gone. The folly was a peculiar structure, some long-dead Dunmore ancestor's romantic affectation. A crumbling quarter circle of Gothic arches overgrown with ivy, tucked into the estate's furthest corner where the formal gardens surrendered to untamed moorland. In summer it smelled of wild thyme and old stone. In October, at midnight, with a half-moon sliding behind clouds, it smelled of frost and urgency. Callum was already there when she arrived, breathless from walking fast and wrapping her cloak tight against the cold. He had a single lantern, shuttered low. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the flagstone path, and the expression on his face stopped her breath entirely, not because it was warm, though it was, but because it was frightened. In 4 years, she had never seen Callum Mackay frightened. "You came," he said. "Your note was not designed to allow refusal," she replied, "which was easier than I would walk across broken glass to reach you," which was the truth. He looked at her for a moment in that particular way of his, as though taking inventory of something precious and cataloging it against the possibility of future loss. Then he said, "Isadora, I need you to listen very carefully to what I am about to tell you, and I need you to suspend, temporarily, whatever instinct you have to argue with me until I've finished. That instinct is one of my best qualities. It is the best," he said quietly, "which is why I'm asking you to hold it. Just for a moment." She stepped fully into the folly, out of the wind. "Tell me." He did not speak immediately. He set the lantern on the crumbling ledge of the arch and turned to face her fully, and she saw, in the thin gold light, that whatever he was about to say had been weighing on him for some time. Not hours, but weeks. Perhaps longer. "Pemberton is not what your father believes him to be," he said. "In what respect?" "In almost every respect that matters." He paused, and she recognized the pause. He was choosing his words with the deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed this and discovered that no rehearsal is adequate. 3 weeks ago, a letter arrived at the estate addressed to your father, bearing the Pemberton seal. When it had been misdirected, placed among the estate correspondence by accident or by design, I cannot say which. I intercepted it in the course of reviewing the Morning Post. You read a letter addressed to my father. I did. She said nothing. Something in the quality of her silence told him to continue. The letter was not from Pemberton himself. It was from a man in Paris. A man whose name appears in French government correspondence pertaining to the financing of military operations in support of the Stuart cause. He met her eyes. "Pemberton has been routing Highland gold to French ports, Isadora. not as a sympathizer quietly sending funds to a cause he privately supports. As a financier, an architect, a man with contractual guarantees of political reward should Prince Charles succeed. She absorbed this. The frost pressed around them. A cloud crossed the half-moon, and the folly went darker. "That is treason," she said. "Yes. Against the crown. Against, if discovered, against everyone connected to him." His voice was very steady. "Your father accepted this match in good faith, knowing nothing of this. He sees a title, a fortune, a future secured for you. He does not see that by aligning this family with Pemberton, he is walking into the orbit of a man who has powerful enemies on every side of the coming conflict. When the reckoning comes, and it will come, Isadora, the army is already moving north. They will not make careful distinctions between Pemberton and those who welcomed him into their home." She put her hand against the cold stone arch. The world had tilted, and she needed something solid. "How certain are you?" she asked. "The letter, could it be misread? Could the language be—" "I have spent 3 weeks trying to misread it," Callum said, and the flatness in his voice told her he was not employing rhetoric. He had genuinely tried. He had wanted to be wrong. "There is no other construction. The amounts, the dates, the names of the French intermediaries, it is unambiguous." "Then my father must be told." "Yes. Tonight, tomorrow at the latest." "Yes." A pause. "There is more." She looked at him. The lantern hissed softly in the wind. "How did you come by this?" she asked. And this time the question carried a weight it had not carried before. Because she was already, at the edges of her understanding, beginning to sense the shape of what was coming. The educated steward. The letter read without hesitation. The 3 weeks of private investigation, and conducted alone. "Callum, how did you come by the capacity to recognize those names? To understand what that correspondence meant?" He did not look away from her. That, at least, she would remember afterward. That when the moment came to be accountable, he did not look away. "I was recruited," he said, 4 years ago by a man named Colonel Hartley. He operates out of Edinburgh. He builds networks of agents placed within the households of the landed gentry, men who can observe, report, and map Jacobite sympathizers before they become military problems. A beat. "I took the position here because your father's guest lists were considered strategically useful. I was paid. I was given a handler." He looked at her across the thin lantern light. "I filed reports," he said. "On your father. On this household. On everyone inside it." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. "You came here," she said at last, very carefully, "to spy on my father's household." "Yes." "For the government?" "Yes." "For 4 years?" "Yes." Each confirmation landed like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward through everything she thought she had known. She looked at him, this man she had argued philosophy with, laughed with, loved in the careful hidden way of a woman who had no legitimate language for what she felt, and understood that she was looking at someone she had not fully seen before. Not because he had been concealing himself from her, because he had been concealing himself from everyone, including, she suspected, himself. "And you stayed," she said quietly. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her across the thin lantern light, and what she saw in his face was not the controlled composure of the man she knew in daylight. It was something stripped of its scaffolding entirely, honest, undefended, and afraid in a way that had nothing to do with Pemberton or Hartley or the coming war. "You know why," he said. She did know. She just needed a moment to decide what to do with the knowledge that the man she loved had arrived in her life as a calculated instrument of state and had remained as something else entirely. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now Pemberton arrives in 4 days. If your father proceeds with this match, he becomes implicated by association in a treason case that Edinburgh is preparing to bring within the month. I have been instructed to allow Pemberton to walk into a trap, to let the betrothal proceed, let him arrive, and then facilitate his arrest here, at Dunmore Hall, in front of witnesses, destroying my father's reputation in the process." "Yes. And you were going to allow this to happen." The words were hung in the cold air between them. "I was," he said, "until 3 weeks ago, when I read the full scope of Hartley's plan. He doesn't care about your father. He doesn't care about you. He cares about Pemberton, and your family is simply the most convenient net." He stepped closer. "I am not willing to let that happen. You are prepared to betray your handler, your mission. I'm prepared to give your father the chance to refuse this match through his own agency, before Edinburgh removes the choice from him entirely." His voice was low and steady and absolutely certain. "If your father breaks the betrothal, Pemberton arrives to an empty welcome, and the trap springs without Dunmore Hall as the stage. Your family survives." "And you?" she said. "If you warn us, if Hartley discovers you've compromised the operation." "I am not," Callum McKay said quietly, "in the habit of weighing my own safety more heavily than the welfare of people I—" He stopped. The stopped word filled the folly like smoke. "People you what?" she whispered. The moon came out. The moors spread away behind him, silver and immense and ancient, indifferent to the lives being remade at their edge. "People I love," he said. She did not sleep. Dawn found her at her writing desk, drafting and destroying letters to her father, each attempt either too revealing or too opaque to serve its purpose. The fire had burned down to embers. Her hair was still braided from the night. Through the window, the sky was turning from black to the color of a bruise. She had thought, in the folly, that love would make things clearer. She had imagined, in the private theater of hope that she maintained against all rational evidence, that crisis would crystallize choices, strip away the unnecessary, leave only the essential. What she had not anticipated was the way truth complicated everything it touched. Callum had come to Dunmore Hall as a spy. This was fact. He had used her father's household as intelligence gathering ground. He had watched. He had listened. He had reported. And then he had stayed, and built the library catalog, and taught the blacksmith's son his letters, and argued philosophy and the folly, and looked at her across drawing rooms with an expression that rearranged her interior architecture. Was love capable of beginning as calculation and becoming something else entirely? She turned this question over in the way she turned difficult propositions, with the methodical, slightly reckless intellectualism that made her mother despair and that Callum had always met with absolute delighted attention. She thought it was. She thought, in fact, that many things began in one form and became entirely another. Her father had married her mother in a political arrangement and spent 30 years building something that looked, from the inside, remarkably like devotion. The estate's oldest rose had been planted by a Dunmore 300 years dead and now covered half the garden wall in something ferocious and magnificent and entirely its own. Things could begin in pragmatism and end in love. She believed this. What she could not determine was whether this belief was wisdom or desperate self-justification, and she could not determine it alone, at a writing desk, in the last hours before a household woke to prepare for a villain's arrival. So she did what she had always done, in the end, when the architecture of a problem overwhelmed her solitary capacity. She went to find Callum. He was in the estate office. Had been there since before dawn, she suspected, given the quantity of documents spread across the main table and the evidence of candles burned well down. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, took in her expression, and closed the door behind her without being asked. "Your father cannot know I told you this," he said, before she could speak. "That is my first objection," she said. "He must know everything. It is his family, his honor, his choice. You intend to protect him without his knowledge, which means you intend to make decisions for him, and that is exactly what Hartley is doing. The mechanism is different. The disrespect is identical." Callum looked at her for a moment. Then he exhaled, slowly, in the way of a man recalibrating. "You're right," he said. "I am generally right," she said, "which makes me suspect you knew this already, and were hoping I would talk you out of it." "Something like that. We tell him together, this morning, before any preparations for Pemberton's welcome go further." Callum was quiet. In the gray early light, he looked tired in a way that went deeper than one sleepless night. Tired in the way of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, without permission to set it down. "When this is done," she said carefully, "when Pemberton is gone and my father has been told, and whatever storm is coming has been weathered, what do you intend to do?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean your life, Callum. Your actual life. Not the mission, not the role. What do you want?" The question seemed to physically dismantle him, which told her everything about how rarely anyone had asked it. "I want," he began, and stopped. "Tell me." "I want a library," he said, after a long pause. "A real one, with the ledgers replaced by actual books. I want to argue about Voltaire without worrying about who's listening. I want to build something that belongs to me, something honest." A pause. "I want to deserve the things I care about." She heard the weight of that last sentence. The things I care about. The category that contained, she understood, considerably more than ledgers and libraries. "Then let's begin," she said. "Let's go speak to my father." Sir Ewan Dunmore received the information about Lord Pemberton with the particular controlled stillness of a Scotsman raised to consider any external display of emotion a form of defeat. He sat behind his study desk in his wool morning coat, his substantial hands flat on the surface in front of him, and listened to every word with a judge's attention. But when Callum finished, and he had been thorough, precise, and unsparing about his own role, Sir Ewan did not speak for a very long time. Outside, the household was coming to life. The smell of porridge and coal smoke drifted up from below. A dog was barking in the stable yard. "You came here," Sir Ewan said at last, addressing Callum, "to gather intelligence on my associates." "Yes, sir." "You have been reporting to a Colonel Hartley in Edinburgh for 4 years." "Yes, sir." "And at some point during those 4 years, your primary loyalty shifted." It was not quite a question. Callum met his employer's eyes. "It did, sir." Sir Ewan's gaze moved to Isadora. Whatever calculation he performed, it was swift and silent. Then he looked back at Callum. I am, Sir Ewan said, in a tone of magnificent restraint. Going to address that particular matter later, at considerable length. A pause. For now. You are telling me that Pemberton is a Jacobite financier under active investigation by Edinburgh, that his arrest has been planned to take place here, in my home, and that you have chosen to warn me rather than allow the operation to proceed. Yes, sir. Which means, Sir Ewan said, that you have made an enemy of your handler and very likely of the Edinburgh office entire. Yes, sir. And you have done this because... Sir Ewan paused. The pause was doing a great deal of work. Because of my daughter. Because it was right, Callum said. And yes, because of your daughter. Sir Ewan looked at the ceiling for a moment, with an expression suggestive of a man conducting an internal conversation of some complexity. Then he stood. Tico, I will not marry Isadora to a traitor, he said, with a simplicity that contained within it the whole structure of the man's character. Blunt, absolute, and entirely without posturing. Pemberton's welcome will be withdrawn. I will send a letter today. He paused. The political consequences will be manageable. The gossip will be somewhat less so. A look at Isadora that held more tenderness than he would ever allow himself to voice. You are not a commodity to be bartered into the orbit of dangerous men. Father, don't. He held up a hand. We will discuss all of it. But first, Mackay. He turned to Callum, and the temperature in the room dropped precisely 2 degrees. You will remain on this estate. You will not disappear with whatever documents you have been keeping. And you will not make any further contact with Hartley until we have determined together what position this household is going to take. Is that understood? Yes, sir. Good. Sir Ewan moved toward the door, then paused. He had his back to both of them. He said to the doorframe, You are not the man I thought you were, Mackay. A terrible silence. No, sir, Callum said. No, said Sir Ewan. You are considerably more interesting. And he opened the door and walked out. What none of them knew, in the cautious relief of that morning, was that Lord Aldrich Pemberton had already dispatched a rider. Not toward Dunmore Hall, toward a different destination entirely. The letter withdrawing the welcome arrived at Pemberton's Edinburgh townhouse on a Thursday. By Saturday, Lord Aldrich Pemberton had received its contents, read them twice, and dispatched a rider north, not toward Dunmore Hall, toward a different destination entirely. This was information that none of them possessed on Sunday, when the household was still exhaling with the cautious relief of a crisis narrowly averted. Isadora had spent the day in the library, actually reading this time, while the October light moved across the floorboards and Callum worked at the ledger desk nearby, the two of them existing in the same room with the particular, excruciating consciousness of people who have said almost everything and have not yet found the structure to say the rest. At one point he had reached across the reading table to move a candelabra closer to her page. His fingers had brushed her hand. The barest accidental pressure, the lightest contact, had nothing in the language of a respectable household that could be named or acknowledged. She had not looked up from the page. She had gone entirely still, the way a person does when something beautiful is happening, and they are afraid that observation will break it. Isadora, he said. Yes. She still did not look up. I owe you more of an explanation than I have given. You owe me nothing, she said. You gave me truth at considerable personal cost. That is more than most people manage. I gave you partial truth. He closed the ledger. There are things about my history that I have told no one at this estate. that I was asked, required, to keep hidden as part of my arrangement with Hartley. Now she did look up. He was watching her with that expression, the cataloging one, and something behind his eyes was braced for impact. My name, he said, is Callum McKay. That is true. What I have omitted is that my mother was Margaret McKay, born Margaret Drummond, of the Drummond clan of Perthshire, a family with documented Jacobite sympathies stretching back to the rising of 1715. He paused. Hartley recruited me specifically because of that connection. I was the ideal instrument, a man with blood ties to the cause, who had chosen the other side, who could move among Jacobite sympathizers without arousing suspicion. You have kin who support the Stuart claim. I have an uncle, Callum said carefully, who is currently with Prince Charles's forces, somewhere in the borders. He met her eyes. I have not seen him in 6 years. I have not corresponded with him, reported on him, or assisted his cause. But his existence is the reason Hartley owns a part of my life that I would very much like returned to me. Isadora set down her book. She thought about all the ways a person could be trapped. By birth, by blood, by the choices of people who came before them, by the expectations of the class they'd been assigned at birth. She thought about how a baronet's daughter could be sold to an earl as a social strategy, and how a steward's legitimacy could be held hostage by a dead mother's politics. Hartley has been using your uncle as leverage, she said. If I fail to perform, if I make choices that conflict with his instructions, the information about my uncle's whereabouts becomes available to the army. My uncle is a man of 63, Isadora. He followed a prince he believed in, because his entire life was shaped by a story that told him this was honorable. He is not a danger to anyone. A pause. He is, however, my mother's only brother, the last of her family. She stood up. The library was very quiet around them, the fire ticking, the wind at the windows, the vast silence of the moorland beyond. She crossed to where he sat. He rose, reflexively, instinctively, the courtesy of the man absolute and unthinking. And they were very close, closer than they had ever been in an interior, enclosed space, the rules of the house pressing against both of them like glass. What Hartley has done to you, she said, is not justice. It is not service. It is coercion dressed in the language of patriotism, and you owe it nothing. I owe my uncle's safety. Yes, she said, and we will find a way to secure it that does not require you to compromise every principle you have. She was near enough to see the exhaustion in his face, the years of it. Do you hear me? I am not a bystander in my own life, Callum, and I am not a bystander in yours. He looked at her. Something in his face very quietly broke open. You, he said softly, are the most extraordinary woman I have ever encountered. I have been told I am nearly perfect, she said, which made him laugh, a real laugh, startled and sudden, and the sound of it filled the library like light. She should have stepped back. The rules of her world said she should have stepped back, maintained the exact correct distance, observed the 1,000 invisible proprieties that separated them by birth and station and the weight of everyone's expectations. She did not step back. She stayed exactly where she was, close enough to feel the warmth of him, close enough to see the exact color of his eyes, which she had catalogued in her memory so many times that she could have named it. Dark gray, the color of the moor before rain. Whatever comes next, she said quietly, we face it from the same position. Do you agree? Your father will have to manage, she said. Do you agree? He looked at her for one long, suspended moment. The fire ticking, the wind pressing at the glass, the whole rigid, beautiful world pressing in from every side, and said, "Yes." It was later that same evening when the library fire burned low and neither of them moved to leave. Callum had been reading, or performing the appearance of reading, which was not the same thing, and Isadora suspected he knew she knew the difference. She herself had given up the pretense 20 minutes ago and was simply sitting in the chair across from him, watching the fire, listening to the particular quality of the silence between two people who are both acutely aware of the other's precise location in a room. It was Callum who moved first, rising to add another log to the fire, which did not strictly need one, and in doing so crossing within arm's reach of her chair. He crouched at the hearth. She watched the line of his back, the way his shoulders held the tension he otherwise kept so perfectly managed, and something in her chest did what it always did in these moments. That slow, unbearable tightening, like a string wound, one turn too many. He stood, turned, and found her watching him, which she had not attempted to disguise, because they were past the age of pretending that looking at each other was something other than what it was. He did not move away. He did not retreat to his chair and the safe geography of the room. He stood perhaps 2 feet from her and looked at her with an expression so unguarded that she felt the breath leave her body slowly, like water draining from cupped hands. Isadora. Her name in his voice at that register, in that room. It did things she had no respectable language for. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to anything he had said but was, nonetheless, completely accurate. He took 1 step closer. The firelight moved across his face and she could see everything. The exhaustion, the want, the absolute war between what he felt and what he would permit himself. His hand lifted, and almost imperceptibly, toward her, and then stilled. Arrested mid-air by the invisible architecture of every rule that governed the world they both inhabited. She looked at his hand, at the deliberate stillness of it, at the cost written in that stillness. "I know," she said softly. He exhaled, a long, controlled breath that carried within it, she thought, the compressed weight of every unsaid thing, every distance maintained, every correct and careful and suffocating no that propriety had extracted from him over 18 months. "When this is over," he began. "When this is over," she agreed. Not a question, not a condition. A promise made without touching, without any of the things the rules forbade, and all the more devastating for it. He stepped back, put the correct distance between them. Dar returned to his chair with the composure of a man rebuilding himself from the outside in, and she watched him do it, and understood with absolute clarity that she loved him in the way that only becomes possible when you have seen someone choose honor over every easier alternative, repeatedly, at genuine cost. The fire ticked. Outside, the Moors breathed in their ancient, indifferent way. Neither of them slept that night, though they did not know this about each other until considerably later. He arrived on Monday at 4 in the afternoon, without a letter of announcement, without a formal party. One man on a black horse, wearing a greatcoat that had seen weather and road and several 100 miles at pace. He had Callum's cheekbones. He had Callum's height. He was 63, white-haired, with the bearing of a man who had once been a soldier and still carried the habit of occupying space as though prepared to defend it. His name was Alistair Drummond, and he had ridden from the retreating edge of Prince Charles's army, and he was, unmistakably, a man in serious trouble. Callum's reaction to the sight of his uncle in Dunmore Hall's entrance courtyard was the most unguarded thing Isadora had ever seen from him. 6 years of controlled, composed, carefully maintained self-possession simply dissolved. He went down the front steps in 3 strides and crossed the courtyard, and there was an embrace that contained within it 6 years of separation and a lifetime of kinship and whatever complicated grief exists between men who have chosen opposite sides of a cause that was also a family story. Isadora watched from the gallery window. She was not ashamed to watch. It seemed to her one of the most important things she had ever seen. It took less than an hour to understand what Alistair Drummond had brought with him beyond himself. The Jacobite cause, he explained, in Sir Ewan's study with a fire burning high and all of them present, was collapsing. The retreat from Derby had broken something essential. The army was falling apart, men drifting away by night, the dream of a Stuart restoration dissolving into the autumn mud. Alistair had left not from cowardice but from a practical recognition that remaining meant capture, and capture meant execution. A man of his age and limited strategic significance would receive no mercy from the Hanoverian forces now advancing. But in leaving, Alistair had carried something with him. Documents, letters, records of correspondence between Pemberton and the French that detailed not merely the financial arrangements already known to Hartley, but something far larger, a network of British landowners, nobles and gentry both, who had been providing intelligence to Paris for 3 years. 16 names, some of them very prominent. "Pemberton doesn't know I have these," Alistair said. He was calm, in the way of a man who has made peace with the possibility of dying. "But he'll know soon enough that something from the correspondence went missing. There were only a handful of people with access." "He'll trace it to you," Callum said. "He'll trace it to whoever he can reach first." Alistair looked at his nephew steadily. "Which means he'll trace it to you, because you're the only person in my life who is also in his orbit." The room went very still. "He'll think you gave them to Edinburgh," Isadora said. "Yes, miss." She looked at Callum. He was looking at the documents spread on the table. 16 names, 3 years of treason, enough evidence to bring down half a dozen powerful men and protect the other half with the desperate, vicious energy of people who have everything to lose. "Pemberton withdrew his suit because he was warned," she said slowly. "But he doesn't know who warned him. He would assume. His Edinburgh contact told him the operation had been compromised," Callum said. "He would assume a government agent. He doesn't know it was me." A pause. "He doesn't know yet. But if he connects you to Alistair, he will," Alistair said quietly. "Pemberton is not an unintelligent man." Sir Ewan, who had been silent throughout this exchange, looked up from the documents. "How long," he said to Alistair Drummond, "before Pemberton could reasonably make that connection and act on it?" 3 days, perhaps 4. Sir Ewan looked at Callum, then at Isadora. Something moved through his expression. The particular expression of a father understanding that the tectonic plates of his household have shifted permanently, and that there is no returning to the geography that preceded the shift. "Well then," he said. And he stood up. "We have 3 days." What they decided, and it was a we in the fullest sense, all 4 of them. Alistair's grey head bent over the table beside Sir Ewan's silver one while Callum and Isadora stood opposite with the documents between them. Was this. The 16 names would go to Edinburgh. Not to Hartley, whose own loyalty had become questionable given the depth of his investment in a plan that sacrificed a blameless family for political convenience, but to a different contact. A judge named Fairweather, who Callum trusted, and who had, over 4 years, given him reason to believe the trust was warranted. Alistair would leave Dunmore Hall before dawn on Tuesday and travel west toward the coast, where Callum had contacts who could move a man to France or the Irish coast, or wherever he chose to be not here. This part of the plan was spoken about in the careful, vague language people use when they are arranging things that require no written record. Callum would deliver the documents to Edinburgh himself, alone, in the full knowledge that Hartley would discover the betrayal of his operation and that whatever professional protection he had enjoyed was now forfeit. "You'll be stripped of your position," Isadora said, when her father had gone to write the letter to Fairweather, and Alistair had gone to be fed by the kitchen staff, who asked no questions. "It's very likely. You'll have no employment, no reference that you can safely use, no income." "Also likely." She looked at him across the table where the documents were still spread, candlelight moving over 16 names and 3 years of careful treachery. "And then what?" "And then I am an educated man with 4 years of estate management experience and a reasonable knowledge of several legal and political systems," he said, with the slight edge of rueful humor that she had learned to recognize as the way he managed things that frightened him. "I expect I will manage." "Callum." She put her hand flat on the table. "Stop being composed for a moment and tell me honestly, what do you want to happen? After Edinburgh, after all of it, what do you want your life to look like?" He looked at her hand on the table, then at her face. "I want," he said, with such careful, deliberate honesty that each word felt like it was being individually extracted from somewhere very deep, "to have earned the right to ask you a question that I currently have no business asking." The fire shifted. A log settled. The candles leaned their light toward him. "Ask it anyway," she said. He was quiet for one long moment. Then, "When this is over, when I am no longer employed here, no longer operating under Hartley's arrangement, no longer in possession of any claim to social acceptability whatsoever, would you consider the possibility of a future with a man who has nothing to offer but his actual self? His entirely honest, unglamorous, unlanded, untitled, absolutely genuine self?" She had imagined this moment in the private theater of hope for 18 months. She had imagined it with candlelight and better circumstances, and probably a considerably shorter preceding crisis. She had not imagined this. Documents on the table, a villain 3 days away, a household in controlled disarray, both of them tired and frightened and completely, absolutely certain. "I would consider it," she said, with something approaching enthusiasm. Something in his face did what it had done in the library. The quiet breaking open, the undefended vulnerability of a man who has been carrying armor so long that setting it down changes his entire posture. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. Not the accidental brush of the library. Intentional. Present. Real. "Your father will have a great deal to say," he said. "He will say it loudly and at length, and then he will come around," she said. "He is a reasonable man who has spent 30 years pretending to be otherwise. I know him rather better than he knows I do." Callum looked at their hands on the table. "I love you," he said. "I should have told you months ago, and I couldn't. And I am telling you now because there may not be a better moment, and I refuse to be a man who lets the best things go unsaid." "I love you," she said, with the straightforwardness of a woman who has spent 22 years being graceful, and is now, at the most important juncture of her life, choosing to be simply honest. I have loved you since the thunderstorm in the library, which I am certain you knew. I had suspicions, he said, and there it was again. That sudden, startled laugh, the one that filled rooms with light. Alistair Drummond left before the sky lightened, sucked on a quiet horse with a saddle pack, and a letter from his nephew, and £40 from Sir Ewan Dunmore, who pressed the money into the old man's hand with the wordless, slightly aggressive generosity of a Scotsman who will not be thanked. Callum rode west with him for 2 hours, to the crossroads at Howick, where Alistair would turn toward the coast, and Callum would eventually turn north toward Edinburgh. They rode in the early morning dark, the moors breathing around them, frost silver and immense. At the crossroads, Alistair stopped his horse and looked at his nephew for a long moment. "She's a remarkable woman," he said. "She is. Her father's going to give you a very difficult time." "I know." "Good." Alistair nodded, with the satisfaction of a man tying off the last thread of a long knot. A man who earns something difficult values it appropriately. He looked at the road north. "You're going to Edinburgh?" "Yes." "Hartley will be furious." "Yes." "The documents will be enough. Fairweather is a good man. I know of him. He'll handle it properly." A pause. "The 16 names won't thank you." "No." Alistair looked at his nephew. Really looked at him, with the particular focus of an old man making a memory. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said. "She always said you had the sense to know which side of a line to stand on. She just hoped you'd choose a line worth standing on." "I think I have," Callum said. "Aye." Alistair turned his horse west. "You have." He did not look back. He rode into the grey morning light, and the road curved, and then he was gone. Callum sat at the crossroads for a moment, being alone with the frost and the distance. Then he turned north. He rode faster. He wanted to be done with it. He wanted to come home, and for the first time in 4 years, he knew exactly where home was. The figure appeared at the crest of the Middleton Road, perhaps a quarter-mile back, motionless on a grey horse, making no effort to close the distance. Callum did not slow. A man who slows announces that he has seen. He kept his pace and his eyes forward, and counted his heartbeats with the cold discipline of someone who had been trained. He now understood, not by the crown, but by its enemy. The figure did not follow. It simply watched him go, which was worse somehow than pursuit. Pursuit meant urgency. A man who watches and waits means he already knows where you're going. He rode for 3 hours before he permitted himself to think. This was a discipline he had built over years. The practiced compartmentalization of a man whose survival had depended on keeping the interior life separate from the operational one. He was good at it. He had been good at it for so long that he had occasionally wondered whether there was anything left in the interior rooms, or whether the habit of closing them had eventually emptied them entirely. Isadora had answered that question, definitively, repeatedly, with the infuriating, magnificent thoroughness she brought to everything. The road was empty. The moors stretched away on either side, grey gold under a thin autumn sky, and the horse moved steadily northward, and Callum let himself, for the first time in 4 years, be honestly afraid. Not of Hartley. Not of Pemberton or the 16 names or the possible legal consequences of what he was carrying in his saddlebag. Those were practical fears, addressable by practical means, and he had spent 4 years learning to manage them. He was afraid of the other thing, the thing that had no operational solution. 4 years ago, he had ridden south on this same road, younger, leaner, considerably more armored, believing that a man could keep the parts of himself cleanly sorted, the work in one room, the conscience in another. The heart, if it existed at all, somewhere in a locked room in a part of the house he did not visit. He had been wrong about all of it. What had undone him was not her beauty. Though she was, he did not flinch from this. The most beautiful woman he had ever been in a room with. What had undone him was the thunderstorm library afternoon when she had stopped pretending to read and started telling him the truth about her life with the systematic, unflinching honesty of a woman who had been performing perfect competence for so long that the relief of stopping was almost physical. He had recognized it. That was the thing. He had recognized it in her because he had been doing the same performance himself for different reasons, for longer, and recognition between two people who are very good at concealment is the most dangerous thing there is. He thought about what came after Edinburgh, after Fairweather and the documents and whatever reckoning Hartley would arrange. He thought about what it would mean to be genuinely free of it. No mission, no handler, no layered identity, just himself. Still a man from Perthshire, with a dead mother and an uncle he had not seen in 6 years, and an education he had come by through persistence rather than privilege. He thought about Isadora's hand on the library table, her voice saying I would consider it with something approaching enthusiasm, which was, he understood her register by now, completely. Her version of yes, absolutely, without reservation, immediately. The road was long. Edinburgh was at its end, with all its attendant difficulty. He rode faster. Tuesday passed. Wednesday. The household moved through its duties with the surface normality of people who are managing a great deal beneath the visible layer of things. Sir Ewan worked in his study. The letters went out. The letters came back, slowly, bearing information, consequences, the first early tremors of a distant storm. So Isadora waited. She was not, by nature or by practice, a good waiter. She had always preferred action, the direct confrontation with a problem, the clear-eyed approach, the movement through difficulty rather than around it. Waiting in a house while the man she loved rode toward danger required every reserve of self-governance she possessed. She managed it, partly, by working. She wrote 3 letters, one to her mother's cousin in Edinburgh who had social connections that might be useful, one to a school friend whose father sat on the Edinburgh legal bench, and one whose addressee she would not name even to herself, containing certain information about Hartley's methods that she suspected would interest the people to whom it was addressed. She was not, she had decided, a bystander. On Wednesday evening, her father came to find her in the library. He sat in the chair across from the fire, Callum's chair she had begun to think of it, which was probably not yet appropriate but felt accurate, and looked at her for a long moment. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "This is not," he said carefully, "the life I planned for you. No. I had very specific plans. A title, an estate, a comfortable existence inside the structures of things. No scandals, no spies, no—" He gestured vaguely at the general situation. "No happiness?" she offered. He winced. "I was not trying to purchase your unhappiness. I genuinely believed—" "I know, Father." She leaned forward. "I know you believed Pemberton was what he appeared to be. I know all of it came from wanting me secured and safe. I am not angry with you." A pause. "I am, however, not going to pretend that the path you chose and the path I choose are compatible." Sir Ewan was quiet for a moment. He came here as a spy, he said. He stayed as something else. Isadora. He chose us over his mission, she said. He chose truth over safety. He chose to give you the ability to make your own decision, rather than let you walk into a trap. She met her father's eyes. What are the criteria by which we judge a man, father? His birth? His income? Or what he does when it costs him something? Sir Ewan looked at the fire. He had the expression of a man who is being out-argued by someone he himself taught to argue, and who cannot entirely suppress the private satisfaction this produces. He has no income now, Sir Ewan said. No. No title, no land, no reference he can use without risk. Correct. He is, Sir Ewan said. She's in almost every material sense, exactly the wrong man. Yes. A long pause. When he returns from Edinburgh, Sir Ewan said, to the fire, I will speak with him. Another pause. At considerable length and considerable volume, during which time he will be expected to hold his ground. He will, Isadora said. If he holds his ground, Sir Ewan said, with the careful tone of a man making a concession that he will not name as such, we will see. We will see, from Ewan Dunmore, was the closest thing to a blessing she was likely to receive for some time, and she accepted it with both hands. The rider reached Dunmore Hall at noon on Thursday, and he was not Callum. He was a young man, barely 20, in plain riding clothes with a sealed letter bearing no crest. He asked for Miss Dunmore by name and would speak to no one else, and the letter was brief. Miss Dunmore, your friend has reached Edinburgh safely and has delivered what he carried to the correct hands. Fairweather moves quickly. However, Pemberton knows. He knows everything, including the name of the man who warned your father. He has departed Edinburgh by the South Road. I do not know where he is going. I think you do. You have perhaps 12 hours. Use them. A friend of a friend? She read it twice, then she went to find her father at a pace that was not quite running. Pemberton was going to Edinburgh, not to Dunmore Hall, not to the scene of his humiliation, but to the city, to cut off Callum before he could vanish into whatever post-delivery safety he had planned. Isadora understood this with a clarity that felt almost physical. I have to go, she told her father, who had read the letter and gone the particular shade of granite gray that meant he was performing furious calculation behind a composed exterior. Absolutely not, he said. Father, you are not riding to Edinburgh. I'm not asking permission, she said. I am informing you of my intention. The distinction is significant. He stared at her. She stared back. This had always been their relationship at its truest. Two people built from the same granite, locked in mutual recognition of the fact that neither would yield to the other except by choice. You will take Macpherson and Reed, he said. Armed. You will take the traveling coach, not a saddle. You will send word the moment you reach Edinburgh. A pause. And you will bring him back. Yes, she said. Safe. Whole. I want the man back in one piece, Isadora, because I have not yet finished shouting at him. She kissed her father on the cheek, which surprised them both. Then she went to get her coat. The road to Edinburgh in October, with rain beginning at Stowe and a wind coming off the hills that drove it sideways against the coach windows, was not a comfortable journey. Isadora sat in the moving dark of the carriage with her hands folded in her lap, and her mind working at a speed that the body's stillness could not contain. She thought about love, the real kind, Not the romance novel version she had consumed in the library, with the guilty pleasure of a woman who had always suspected the real article would be more complicated and considerably more inconvenient than fiction suggested. The real kind, it turned out, was precisely as complicated and inconvenient as suspected. It was also, she discovered, sitting in a rattling coach in a rainstorm, considerably more important than she had the language to express. He had told her the truth. He had told it at personal cost, expecting nothing. Not gratitude, not protection, not her. Just the clean necessity of honesty for its own sake. And then he had stayed and fought for her family with the same absence of calculation. She had fallen in love with him for the arguments and the laughter and the gray eyes and the patience with the blacksmith's son. She had stayed in love with him for this, for watching a man discover the exact position of his honor and stand on it without apology. Whatever Edinburgh held, she was going toward it. That felt, in every sense that mattered, correct. Edinburgh in October was gaslight and fog, and the smell of coal smoke and the sea distantly present beyond the closes and wynds of the old town. The coach arrived at 9 o'clock, the city loud with its evening business, the castle a dark bulk above the ridge. She had an address. Not Callum's, she did not know where he stayed in the city, but Fairweather's, which the young rider's letter had included in a postscript, in handwriting smaller than the main text, as though it had been added by a different person or at a different moment. Judge Fairweather lived in a townhouse in the new town. He was a compact man in his 50s with intelligent eyes and the manner of someone who has spent decades evaluating what people say against what they mean. He received Isadora at his door at 9:30 without visible surprise, which suggested he had been expecting some form of consequence. "Miss Dunmore," he said. I had wondered when the other party would arrive. He stepped back to admit her. "He is here." She found Callum in Fairweather's study. He had clearly arrived not long before her. His coat was still damp from the rain, and he was standing at the window with a glass of brandy he had not touched, looking out at the lamplit street with the expression of a man who is working through something. He turned when she came in. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The study was warm, fire-lit, crowded with legal volumes and the respectable ordinary life of a decent man. Beyond the window, Edinburgh went about its indifferent business. "How did you—" he began. "You were followed," she said, "or you were going to be. Pemberton left Edinburgh this afternoon." He absorbed this with the stillness of a man adjusting a calculation. "Fairweather has the documents. The process is in motion." "I know. That is not why I came." He looked at her. "I came," she said, "because I am not waiting in a house while you face consequences alone. I came because—" She stopped, started again. "We said we face things from the same position. I am standing in that position. Here." Something happened in his face, not the breaking open this time. Something quieter, deeper. The expression of a man who has lived so long, prepared to be alone, that the opposite of alone requires a moment to fully register. He set the glass down. He crossed the room. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the rain still in his hair, the exhaustion around his eyes, and something behind the exhaustion that was unmistakably joy. "Isadora." "Yes." "Your father is going to be absolutely furious," she said. "I know. He specifically requested that I return you to him in one piece, so that he can shout at you at length." "That's—" A startled exhale of laughter. "That's rather reassuring, actually." "I thought it might be." He took her hands. Both of them, in both of his, and with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing a thing he intends to keep. She was wearing gloves, the correct proprietary gloves that a lady wore in company, and through the thin leather she could feel the warmth of him, the realness. "When this is over," he said, "and the Pemberton matter is resolved, and your father has finished being furious, what would you like the rest of your life to look like?" "I want," she said, with the same careful, word-by-word honesty she had learned from watching him, "to read books I choose, to argue with you about their contents, to build something. I don't know what, I don't know where, but something that belongs to both of us and is honest from the foundation up." She paused. "I want mornings in a library and difficult conversations and the kind of love that knows what it costs and chooses itself anyway." He was looking at her with an expression that she thought she would probably carry for the rest of her life. "We could manage that," he said. "I believe we could." Pemberton was arrested at 6 o'clock the following morning, not by Callum's doing and not at Edinburgh. He was taken at a coaching inn outside Dalkeith by a party of government men acting under Fairweather's authority, and the documents that Alistair Drummond had carried from the collapsing edges of a dream were by noon in the hands of people who would do with them what justice and necessity required. Callum and Isadora received this information in Fairweather's parlour over breakfast, an oddly domestic scene. The three of them with tea and bread, and the morning light coming pale through the rain-spattered windows, the judge explaining the previous night's rapid developments with the measured satisfaction of a man who has done his work well. "The 16 names will be investigated," Fairweather said. "Some will be prosecuted. Others will make arrangements." He said this without elaboration, in the tone of a man who understands that the world contains many kinds of reckoning. "Your involvement, Mackay, is," he considered, "complex. You did operate under Hartley's authority, and you did compromise his operation. But the documents you delivered are of significant value, and Hartley's own methods were, to put it diplomatically, not uniformly above reproach." "Meaning?" Callum said. "Meaning that a quiet arrangement, in which your service is acknowledged and your defection overlooked, is considerably more likely than prosecution. Particularly given that the man you were protecting, a nod to Isadora, is not a traitor, is not a sympathizer, is by all accounts a baronet of impeccable loyalty who was misled by a man he had no reason to suspect." Isadora thought of her father, of his flat hands on the desk, of "we will see." "And Hartley?" she asked. Fairweather's expression became carefully neutral. "Hartley will, I believe, find that his methods have attracted a degree of scrutiny that he will not enjoy." A pause. "Let us say that the information you included in your letter to me, Miss Dunmore," he looked at her with something approaching appreciation, "was also of considerable value." Callum turned to look at her. "You wrote to Fairweather." "I wrote to several people," she said pleasantly. "I told you I was not a bystander." He stared at her. "Several people," he repeated. "My mother's cousin has connections on the legal bench. My school friend's father is a judge, and I have, over the years, conducted a rather extensive correspondence with a professor of law at Edinburgh University, who finds my thoughts on property rights in entailed estates to be, his word, stimulating." She picked up her teacup. "Knowledge is not a passive thing, Callum. One either uses it or wastes it." He continued staring at her. Fairweather, across the table, appeared to be suppressing something. "4 years," Callum said. I spent 4 years gathering intelligence, and you simply... I had certain advantages, she said. No one expects a baronet's daughter to write letters about politics. The invisibility of ornament is, as it turns out, quite useful. Callum put his hand over his eyes. He was laughing. The kind of laughter that starts somewhere deep and surfaces in spite of everything. Your father, he said, when he could speak, has absolutely no idea. None whatsoever, she agreed. Fairweather cleared his throat. He slid a second document across the breakfast table, one that had not been part of the morning's proceedings, in a different hand, with a different seal. There is one further matter, he said quietly. This arrived for you last night, Mackay. I held it until the Pemberton business was settled. He met Callum's eyes. I think you should read it now. Callum took the document. To his expression as he read it was very still. The stillness not of composure, but of a man whose entire understanding of himself is being dismantled, line by line, in the middle of a breakfast room. He set it on the table between them. Isadora read it. The gist was this. Callum Mackay had never been a government spy. Not once. Not ever. The man who recruited him, the man who had represented himself as acting for the crown, was the 17th name on a list of 16. He had spent 4 years believing himself a reluctant agent of the king. He had been Pemberton's instrument all along. The breakfast room was very quiet. Isadora looked up from the letter. Callum was looking at the window, at the October streets beyond it, with an expression that she was still learning, still mapping the full geography of, but which she recognized now as the expression of a man revising the entire structure of a story he had believed to be true. He had not been a spy who turned. He had been a man, manipulated, used, kept compliant through a threat that had never been real, whose entire 4-year tenure at Dunmore Hall, his loyalty, his choices, his very identity, had been built on a foundation constructed by the man they had spent the autumn defeating. Which meant, everything you chose, she said carefully. You chose without any of the context you thought you had. Yes. You chose to warn my father, she said, not knowing that the leverage you feared was false. You chose truth. And us, when you believed you were sacrificing something real. Yes. She reached across the table and took his hand. Flat, direct, real. No gloves this time. The full, warm, human fact of it. Then everything you are, she said quietly, is exactly what you built it to be. Without props, without scaffolding. Just you. He looked at her. Whatever was happening behind his eyes was very large and very still. And you still want... I still want everything I said in this study last night, she said, with somewhat more information now, which only makes the wanting more considered. A pause. Go find my father's study. Why? Because my father, she said, with the calm certainty of a woman who knows the man she intends to marry, has been waiting for you to come to him with a specific question since approximately the 2nd week of January. He has been performing impatience very convincingly, but I know him, and he has been waiting. Callum stared at her. He's been waiting, she said, slightly impatiently. Go. They returned to Dunmore Hall on Friday, arriving at the house in late afternoon as the sky turned amber over the moorland, and the first frost of winter began to settle into the stone. Sir Ewan met them in the courtyard. He looked at Callum for a long moment. Callum met his gaze without flinching. The ground-holding that Isadora had promised he was capable of, delivered without performance or apology. The shout was, as advertised, considerable. It occurred in the study, with the door firmly closed, and it lasted approximately 40 minutes, during which Isadora sat in the library and read 3 pages of the same paragraph on a continuous loop. Shut, and then the study door opened. Her father came out, followed by Callum, who looked somewhat as though he had walked through a controlled weather event, but was fundamentally intact. Sir Ewan looked at his daughter. "He held his ground," he said. "I said he would." He argued back. "I should hope so." "He was," Sir Ewan said, with the expression of a man performing a small but complete surrender of a long-held position. "Entirely reasonable, which is deeply inconvenient." He turned back to Callum. "You have no position here, as of this moment. Your employment is terminated." "I understand," Callum said. "However..." Sir Ewan's expression shifted into something careful and complex. "I am in need of a land agent for the northern portion of the estate. A legitimate appointment, properly contracted, marked with salary commensurate with the responsibilities. The previous man left for Inverness in August. The position requires someone with excellent legal knowledge, estate management experience, and the particular disposition to tell me when I am wrong." A pause. "I believe you may be qualified." The courtyard was very quiet. "That is," Callum started. "It is a position of employment," Sir Ewan said firmly. "Nothing more. At this time, it provides income. It provides legitimate standing. It provides a structure within which certain..." He glanced at Isadora with a look that contained multitudes. "Conversations may be had at appropriate intervals, with appropriate deliberateness, and with what I can only hope will be appropriate patience on all sides." "Yes, sir," Callum said. "Good." Sir Ewan turned toward the house. "Come inside. It's cold, and Mrs. Grant has made lamb stew, and I intend to be furious tomorrow instead." He paused at the door. "Both of you." That evening, with the household settling into its winter quiet, fire in the drawing room, lamps lit against the early dark, frost making stars of the window panes, Isadora found Callum in the library. He was at the window, looking out at the moors in the last of the light, and he turned when she came in with the particular quality of attention he had always given her. Complete, unhurried, as though she were the most interesting thing that had happened to him in a very long time. "He offered you the position," she said. "He did. Are you going to take it?" He looked at her. "Are you going to advise me to?" "I'm going to point out," she said, "that you told me you wanted a library, a real one, and that you wanted to build something honest from the foundation." She gestured at the room around them, the shelves, the fire, the catalog in his handwriting still in the corner. "This is a beginning. It is not an ending." "No," he said. "It is very much not an ending." The fire moved. The frost pressed its stars against the glass. Outside, the moors were silver dark and ancient and entirely indifferent to the small, enormous events occurring within their sight. He crossed to where she stood. She did not pretend to be otherwise than what she was, a woman in love, entirely clear-eyed about the complications and the costs and the glorious, inconvenient reality of choosing a life because it is true, rather than because it is safe. He took her face in his hands, slowly, carefully, with all the deliberateness of a man who has spent a long time being precise about the things that matter. And he kissed her, at last, in the library where it had begun, with the sound of the wind outside and the fire in the grate, and the whole long, patient story finally arriving at its first, real beginning. She kissed him first. Later, she would think about this. How love that begins in secrets does not have to end in them. How truth, spoken at the right moment, at personal cost, by a person who has chosen it over every comfortable alternative. How that truth becomes the foundation of something that can survive anything built on top of it. How a man who learns he was used does not become defined by the using. How a woman who was meant to be bartered learns that she was always, already, something else entirely. How the best things begin in libraries during thunderstorms and continue through folly gardens at midnight and survive ridden roads and angry fathers and collapsing armies and the long patient work of two people choosing each other daily in the ordinary and extraordinary ways that love requires. She never stated any of this aloud. It simply lived in the choices they made. The arguments, the laughter, the letters, the long evenings in the library where the catalog had been replaced, at last, by actual books, and where the best conversations of her life continued without apology or interruption for a very long time. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, as the best and worst things always seemed to. It bore a London crest, not Pemberton's. That seal had been broken and would not be made whole. This was a different crest, one that Callum recognized with a stillness that caused Isadora, watching from across the breakfast table, to set down her coffee with the particular attention she reserved for moments that were going to matter. "What is it?" she asked. He read it twice. Then he set it on the table between them, and she read it herself. It was brief. Judicial letterhead, signed by 3 names she recognized from her own correspondence. The gist of it was this: Callum McKay had been formally cleared of any misconduct pertaining to the Edinburgh operation. His service over 4 years was acknowledged. There was a postscript, in different handwriting, smaller. "Mr. McKay, the man who recruited you to Hartley's operation in 1741 has been under separate investigation since autumn last. His name appears on a list you will recognize. It is a list of 16. His name is the 17th. You were not recruited as an agent of the Crown. You were recruited as an instrument of Pemberton's intelligence network. You were never a government spy, Mr. McKay. Everything you believed yourself to be acting in service of was a fabrication. Your uncle is innocent of every charge that might have been brought against him. There were no charges. There was only a fiction constructed to hold you in compliance. The rest, I leave to you." Callum stood. He looked at her, the library behind her, the frost on the glass, the February light, all of it, with the expression she had decided, some weeks ago, to simply accept as the ongoing condition of being loved by this particular man. It was the most honest thing she had ever been given. He went. She turned back to the window. Outside, the moors were silver and immense under a thin winter sky. The birch trees along the boundary wall were bare still, but there were the beginnings, barely visible, barely possible, of buds. The smallest indication of a spring that was coming. He came back to the library 40 minutes later. He was, she assessed him in the doorway, somewhat more disheveled than he had left, having apparently encountered the considerable personality of Sir Ewan Dunmore at full conversational velocity. He also had an expression that she recognized as the suppression of something very large. "Well?" she said. He said yes, Callum said. She felt the smile start somewhere around her chest. "What exactly did he say?" "He said..." Callum paused. He said, and I am quoting directly, "You have the most inconvenient timing of any man I have ever met. You are completely unsuitable in every measurable way. And you are exactly the kind of man this family has always needed and been too prideful to admit it. She'll argue with you every day of your life. You should know that before you ask. That sounds accurate, Isadora said. I told him I was counting on it. He crossed the library. He seemed to take that as the correct answer. She stood. The fire was behind her. The frost was on the glass. The library was exactly as it had been on the afternoon of the thunderstorm. The same shelves, the same light, the same particular quality of possibility that had been there from the first real conversation. Isadora Dunmore, Callum said, and there was nothing in his voice now that was careful or managed or held at a careful distance. There was only the man, the actual man, built from his own choices, standing in the honest foundation of everything they had made. Will you do me the entirely impractical, socially questionable, personally essential honor of becoming my wife? She looked at him. Her spy who was never a spy. Her steward who had catalogued her heart alongside the ledgers. The man who had chosen truth when lies would have been safer and love when duty would have been simpler. Yes, she said, with the absolute, an uncomplicated certainty of a woman who has spent 22 years being perfectly correct and has decided that she prefers to be perfectly sure. With great enthusiasm, immediately, before you or my father or any political consequence can make it complicated. He laughed. The real one, the startled one, the one that filled rooms, and took her hands, and in the library where everything had begun, under the pale February sky, with the moors stretching away to the horizon and the whole honest future opening ahead of them. She kissed him first, or so she believed, until the morning, 6 weeks later, when a second letter arrived. This one bore no crest, no signature, only 4 lines in a hand she did not recognize. Miss Dunmore, soon to be Mrs. McKay, I understand. Congratulations are in order. I write not to threaten, but to forewarn. There is a 17th name on that list I mentioned, and a 17th name implies a 17th story. Your husband's history goes back further than Edinburgh, further than Hartley, further, I suspect, than he himself knows. Ask him where he was in the winter of 1738. Ask him what he was called then. And ask him, most importantly, who taught him to read. The answer will change everything again.